We're going to talk about the Great Depression today, the worst economic period in America's history. It begins in 1929. It's going to last throughout the 1930s. Even you could carry it into the very early 1940s. Basically, World War II, which begins in Europe in 1939. America joins in 1941. But that's going to put a lot of people back to work, and it's going to help to end the Depression. But the time period, very, very tough. As the pictures here show, they don't look like good times for the families that are shown there. All right, so to start, President Herbert Hoover, he was the president when the Depression began. He was elected in 1928, takes office in 1929. He's a Republican. The Depression, it's not his fault the Depression begins, but his approach to it does make the situation worse. As the Depression is beginning, as the economic situation in the country in the 1920s were this boom time economically, there were some warning signs maybe that were missed, but as the economic situation for the nation becomes worse, his approach is to have individuals fix their problems themselves. Does not think government should help out. He thinks it's okay for private charities, churches, they can help out, but he does not think the government should be involved at all in helping to fix the economic situation. Others would share his same opinion at the time. However, the lack of government intervention does make the situation worse. And because of how big of an economic crisis this was, there probably needed to be some help earlier on. But we'll look at here the causes. So we're going to look at a few different causes of the Great Depression. One factor that leads to the Great Depression in the U.S. was the excessive amount of lending by banks, which caused more debt for people. So it was very easy in the 1920s to get access to credit from the bank, which meaning that you could have, without having cash, you could get a loan. You could not a plastic credit card like say, but you could have that type of setup where without having all or even maybe any cash down, just off of credit, you can buy things and then you'll pay it back in installments over time. However, it was so easy to get credit that people were able to buy, and there's a lot of new inventions too. I think the car becomes more available, the radio, washing machines. There's all these things that you would want that'd be very beneficial. Advertising's really picking up in the 1920s. They're telling people you must have these things, and people kind of fall into that trap of buying things that they maybe can't afford. But because of how easy it was to get that credit, people accrued more and more debt, and eventually, as a warning sign, if you use a credit card in your life, you have to pay it back, and people weren't able to pay it back. And so not only is that bad for that individual, but if they're not paying it back, then the banks are losing out. The company that sold the products losing out. So it's going to be a problem for more than just that individual who maybe wasn't wise with their money. So with this increase in credit, the Federal Reserve, which is basically the nation's banking system, they will issue policies at all times to try to keep the economy going in a good direction. So they attempt to curb that excessive credit by constricting or restricting the amount of money in supply and circulation. That's something they can do. And however, it makes sense. Okay, less money available. That way, people won't have as much credit, so they're not going to be able to go into debt. So the problem won't happen again. The problem was already here. All right, so it wasn't a case of will it happen again. It's right now we're in the middle of the problem. This just makes it worse, because now it's more difficult for people to repay their debt. Businesses, more difficult for them to, get a loan, maybe to expand their business, to build something new, to open a new business. Banks, they're not able to issue as much, as many loans. Well, that's how they make money, is through the interest on those loans. So it's a tough time for banks too. And if it's tough for businesses, tough for banks, that they're going to maybe lay off workers. So now workers don't have jobs. So now they can't pay back their loans anyway because they have no income coming in. So it's just this big, snowball effect where it's just there's something bad's going on, and then decisions are made, maybe in best intention, but the reality of the situation maybe wasn't completely apparent. And as you can see, that chart, investments dropping considerably in America. So the problem is that people are just they're unable to get money, and without any investment, places are laying off more and more workers. And so individuals are having more and more difficult times to just, meet their day-to-day bills. All right. Now, the most famous cause of the Great Depression that you'd probably be familiar with would be the stock market crash, and that's another issue. It's not the only issue, but again, that's another issue. So with these, problems of too much debt, limited amount of money in supply, and then also you have something called stock market speculation, which was going on. Investors are buying on margin. I'll explain that in a second, with the hope of making huge profits. However, the collapse of the crash of the stock market leads many to lose their investments, lose their fortunes. Businesses close due to maybe their investments in companies, and then that means more workers aren't working. It means more workers are in debt because they can't pay off their loans that they have, and so it's just, again, that problem just gets worse and worse. But you can see here, this shows an example of a company that has a stock price of over almost $400, $386. And then, a couple years later, the price is down to $40.60. So the value of a stock is dropping considerably. Just to show an example, and we'll talk about this more if you're able to make the Zoom meeting on Tuesday or Wednesday of the week. We'll go over stock price. You can pick some examples, but Apple. So Apple, computers, very famous company. There you see the number changes. So during the business day, people can buy and sell stock. And what stock is, you own basically a portion of the company. So for right now, $117.08, I could buy one share of stock in Apple Computers, and I own one share of Apple. People will buy more than one share because the idea is if you buy stock, you can possibly sell that stock later on, and hopefully at a profit. You would hope the price goes up. So if you buy it for $100 and you sell it for $200, you just made $100. But if you own 10 shares or if you own 100 shares, now you multiply that and you make obviously much more money. So people would buy a lot of stock. In the 1920s, the prices of stocks you could say they were overvalued. They should not have been as high as they were, but people thought the stock market would just continually go up. So what people did, and these are some of the problems here, is people would take out life savings to buy stocks. And the problem is, as you saw in that earlier graph, sometimes stock prices go down. And when the stock price drops, it just dropped 8 cents. When the stock price drops, if it drops enough, maybe the company goes out of business. Now the stock's worth nothing. Or it goes down a lot and you try to sell it just to, mitigate your loss. You don't lose too much, but you're not making as much money and you lost money on it. And if you took it out of your life savings now, that's a problem if any other issues come up for you. But another problem was, and that's this term here, buying on margin. So people would buy on margin. What that means is you would buy this stock for a percentage. So if the stock was $100, you maybe would buy it for 10%. So you'd give $10 and you'd buy one share of $100 priced stock. The other $90, you're going to pay interest on. It's going to be like a loan. Well, again, if that company goes out of business, if you lose your life savings, you might not be able to pay back that loan. If you lose your job, you might not be able to pay back that loan. So people being in debt, again, that just is another way where people are getting in debt. And then if anything bad happened, which it did with the Depression, they weren't able to pay back. All right, so Franklin Roosevelt gets elected president in 1932, takes office then in 1933. He's a Democrat, so he comes from a different party. He's going to be president during the Great Depression and World War II. He's actually the only president elected for 4 terms. Today, that's not even allowed. You can only be elected 2 terms, and amendments can be added after his death to change it. But he had a different approach from Herbert Hoover of how to deal with the Great Depression. He thought the government had to help. So it wasn't just individuals. He felt the government had to help. And he had 3 R's. Relief. So initially, there are people who are starving. There are people who have lost their homes. In many parks around the country, developed homeless towns, basically, in Central Park in New York City and other places around the country. And they called them Hoovervilles. They named them after, Herbert Hoover. But they would just use cardboard or any, piece of scrap metal to create a makeshift shack to live in. So he didn't want people living in that. He wanted people to be able to live in a house. So first off, relief. Make sure people have food to eat and shelter. Then recovery. Try to help people, the businesses and the people recover from this terrible situation. And then finally, reform is the 3rd R, which would mean that, how can things be changed so this never happens again? How can we adjust American society so that we don't have this problem again? And his plan is called the New Deal. So it's like a new deal for the nation, a new plan for the nation to fix the economic, doom that people are living in. A big thing there will be multiple questions on your quiz this week, all asking basically the same answer. And it's the title of this slide: Increased Role of Federal Government. The federal government is the national government. So think Washington, D.C., the president and Congress and Supreme Court. That's the federal government. The U.S. government is the federal government. Then you have state government and local government. But again, so federal government is national government. During the 1930s, during the Great Depression, the role of the federal or national government greatly expands. And this happens because of New Deal legislation, policies, and agencies that are created. Some of these are still around to this day. Some no longer are. But some examples are the Social Security Act, National Recovery Administration, Securities and Exchange Commission, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, and then there are public works programs, Works Progress Administration, Tennessee Valley Authority, Civilian Conservation Corps. Those last section of public works, there'd be jobs were created to do something for the public. Government-funded projects. The Tennessee Valley Authority is still around this day, helping provide electricity to the Tennessee Valley region. The other two are no longer around. But they're, at least at the time, we have a lot of people unemployed. Well, how about the government just creates jobs, basically, for people? There's always something that can be done, or a new sidewalk can be paved, or a school can be built. So I'll talk about a few of these agencies on the next couple of slides. Social Security Act. This is signed into law in 1935. It's still around this day. You have a card that looks like that, when you were born, that has a Social Security number for you. The point of this was to provide safety net for elderly, unemployed, and disadvantaged Americans. At the time, prior to this, there were other types of these that popped up, but nothing even close to the size of Social Security. Basically, when you retire from working, you kind of, maybe if you were to save up money throughout your life, otherwise you would become a burden to your family, your younger working family. If you had kids, they would then maybe have to take you in after retirement. People didn't live as long back then as they do today, but nonetheless, it was a problem that, elderly people or someone who lose their job, maybe someone with a disability, they didn't have that safety net from the government. So Social Security was created, and it would pay financial benefits to retirees at age 65. This has changed over the years. It's somewhat controversial today because of the finance of it. Back then, when it started, for every 10 working Americans, there was one retired person. Today, it's closer to about 3 Americans work for one retired or one person getting Social Security benefits. As the population lives a lot older, lives a lot longer lives today. So that's one of the problems there. Nonetheless, it provides a great benefit. Even most people will support it, even though it's sometimes how's it funded becomes a issue of political debate. But again, Social Security was a way to give benefit to elderly, unemployed, disadvantaged Americans. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. This is still around to this day. If you've been in a bank or if you've seen a commercial for a bank, you have seen or maybe heard either seen written or heard mentioned the phrase member FDIC. So a bank that is a member of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation insures their deposits up to $250,000 today. It was not as much back then, but when this began in the 1930s. But the point of this is, if you have your money in Chase Bank or Huntington Bank, if that bank today closes and goes out of business, your money is still insured. No matter, as long as if you have up to $250,000, anything less than that in your bank account, the government would insure it. So you don't have to worry about that money not being safe in a bank. In the 1930s, before this was created, the beginning of the Great Depression, there were a lot of banks that closed. And if the bank closed for good, and your money was in there, it was gone. So maybe you had $1,000 or maybe you had $2,000 in a bank account, and it was gone. So people would take money out of their bank account because they didn't want to risk that happening to their bank, which banks need money deposited so they can provide loans and other services to people, which made more banks close. So this was created and still around to this day to ensure that your money in a bank is safe. The last one here I'll talk about, this is the most famous public works program, is the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. The WPA was a short-lived agency that lasted for about 8 years, but employed about 8.5 million Americans. And they did all kinds of things. They built schools, playgrounds, roads, airports, painting murals, much, much more. Some pictures here. So the ball field here is Ipes Field in near Struthers on the south side of Youngstown. This was a ball field in a park that was built by the WPA. you may see pavilions like this in Mill Creek Park. Many of them were built by the WPA. If you've been to the Canfield Fair, the grandstand, that building was built by the WPA. A couple years ago, when talking about this topic, somebody in class was able to actually pull up a picture. Camel, their stadium, if you played soccer or football there, been there with the band or cheerleading. They have a nice updated, renovated stadium, but they still have, part of the original WPA built stadium, and there's a big WPA logo on there, a concrete block on their stadium. Many places, locally and across the country, built using funding through the WPA. Basically, again, walk down your street, walk down your road, drive down your road. You can probably see places that need, maybe a little bit of upkeep. All right, and that's the same case in every city around the country. So the government basically said, well, we could upkeep, do some of that upkeep and put people to work in a very, very, expensive project. So the WPA helped to employ many Americans during the Great Depression. The last part here about the Great Depression is the Great Depression was bad. It was a terrible time, but it wasn't equal to everybody. Some people suffered more than others. Many minority groups, especially African Americans, were heavily discriminated during by New Deal programs. There's often a phrase that was said, last hired, first fired. So for many African Americans, they would be the last person hired if there was an opening at a position during the 1930s. And if somebody had to be let go, it was typically an African American who would be the first fired. And another incident that really ravaged the middle of our country, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, that area, was something called the Dust Bowl. And you have these humongous, this is not a cloud in the sky, this is like on the ground, huge cloud of dust that swept across, and this for multiple years, across the middle of our country. And sometimes these dust clouds would actually blow all the way, basically halfway across the country. There's pictures and video, and I can show you these during a Zoom meeting as well, of dust clouds sweeping across New York City, the Statue of Liberty in New York City, over almost 2,000 miles away from where this started, just being swallowed up by these dust clouds that were caused by drought and over farming of the land. And just it was one more thing that made the Great Depression such a terrible, terrible time for many. But it's important to understand that the Depression was bad for all, but the Depression was worse for some groups based maybe on their race or where they lived.